There are many old houses in our town, but none quite so sadly romantic as number 27, Chestnut Avenue. It isn't a particularly large house, I would guess about 4 bedrooms, and is set back off the road in a reasonably sized garden which is now much overgrown, to the point where it is virtually impossible to see the house from the road. The reason that number 27 is both sad and romantic is that it has stood empty for the last 60 years, quietly decaying on its peaceful plot. In the middle 1950s, the house had been the happy home of a prominent local family, by name Stevenson, having been in possession of their family since it was built towards the end of the 18th century. The 1950s occupants had been the local doctor, his wife, and their 2 young daughters. Tragically, all 4 had been murdered during a robbery that went horribly wrong. The perpetrators had been caught and sentenced to life imprisonment. They were, in one sense, fortunate to escape hanging, which had only just been abolished in the UK. By the 1950s, the family once so extensive and prominent had dwindled to a mere handful. As the doctor had never got round to making a will, it took quite some time to achieve probate and find the next of kin who would inherit. As it turned out, the heir was a sheep farmer in Australia, where his branch of the family had emigrated in the late 19th century. He had no intention of moving to the UK and put the house on the market. However, owing to its sad history, there was no interest shown by anyone in buying it, and, after a while, the sheep farmer lost interest. He had no need of either the house or the money, being a very rich man in his own right. Number 27 just sat there, its paint peeling and the garden gradually becoming more and more overgrown. And so it has stood to this very day. Such is the background to my story. My name is Sam Jackson and I am a journalist on the Courier, our local newspaper. One morning my editor called me into his office. As I entered, I saw he had 2 young visitors with him. These were introduced to me as Sarah Wainwright and Paul Hughes, and they were students studying history at our local university. My editor explained that they were researching the Stevenson family as part of their coursework, and in the process of digging through old documents had come across a deed box that had lain unopened in the offices of the Stevenson solicitors for over 40 years since the abortive attempt to sell the property. In fact, somehow or other, Paul and Sarah had managed to convince the solicitors to loan them the deed box, which they found to contain, amongst other interesting material, the keys to number 27, Chestnut Avenue. Paul and Sarah had decided that they were going to visit the house, but, recognizing that the solicitors might not approve of this, had imaginatively approached our paper to see whether we might wish to accompany them and write up the experience. 60 years after tragic murder, you get the general idea. Their thinking was that if the story of their visit to number 27 was in the public domain and had generated local interest, it was less likely that the solicitors would risk making a fuss when they found out. My editor thought this an intriguing prospect and informed me that I would be the one to accompany Paul and Sarah and write up the story. "I'll send along a photographer," he announced. "Hopefully he will be able to get some spooky, atmospheric pictures. I would like to make this our major general interest feature for next Saturday's edition." So that was that. I had an assignment and Paul and Sarah had covered their backs. Accordingly, the following morning the 3 of us plus the photographer assembled outside the gate to number 27. I was pleased to see that the photographer assigned to me was Graham James. He was an older, experienced man with whom I had worked many times in the past. In fact, he had acted as my mentor when I was a tyro journalist just starting to cut my teeth in the profession. I had spent the previous evening reading up on the facts of the murder in the newspaper's archive. It had been a particularly shocking affair. Dr. John Stevenson and his wife Mary had just put their young daughters Alice, 9, and Wendy, 7, to bed and were settling down for a quiet evening in. Dr. John heard the sound of breaking glass coming from the back of the house and went to investigate. He found 2 intruders in the kitchen who panicked on being discovered and struck out with the crowbar they had used to force an entry. John was hit on the temple and fell to the floor dead. Apparently Mary had, foolishly, followed John to the kitchen and screamed as she saw her husband killed in front of her eyes. Her screams must have awoken the girls because when the bodies were discovered the following day, those of the 2 girls lay at the foot of the stairs. The 2 intruders, having killed the whole Stevenson family in a fit of panic, fled. They were apprehended a few days later and, at the subsequent trial, told the court that they had believed the house would be empty that night. As I have already explained, owing to a recent change in the law, they escaped hanging but were sentenced to life imprisonment. As I now looked at the old house where these tragic events had occurred, I couldn't help shivering. Everything looked so peaceful in the summer sun, it was hard to believe what had happened here 60 years previously. Paul took the keys to the house from his pocket. "I hope this will still work," he said. "It has been years since they were last used and there is a real possibility that the locks have rusted solid." So saying, he inserted the key and turned it. To the surprise of all of us, the door opened smoothly. There was no squeak of rusted hinge or groan of distorted wood. Graham was busily snapping away, taking pictures of the outside of the house as well as of the 2 students making an entry. We all stepped inside. Given that it had been locked up for over 50 years, the house smelt remarkably sweet. In fact, the interior of the house was in a much better state of preservation than its outside condition would have led us to expect. There wasn't a great deal of dust and evidence and none of the window panes were broken. This latter fact was particularly amazing, as the first thing small boys tend to do on discovering an empty, abandoned house is to throw stones through the windows. It was almost as if the house was protecting itself by scaring people away, a fanciful notion that I briefly considered and then rejected as part of the opening paragraph for my story. The next surprising thing to strike us was that the house was still furnished. Apparently, having failed to sell, it had just been locked up and left. Oriental rugs lay on the hall floor and a long case clock stood against a wall. As we looked into other rooms, they too were fully furnished, mostly with antique pieces that presumably had come down through the family, but also with artifacts redolent of the 50s, a Bakelite radio, small screen, black and white television set, and capacious, artificial leather armchairs. The kitchen was pure 1950 with an upright gas stove, twin-tub washing machine, and primitive refrigerator. These were expensive items in the 50s, so clearly the Stevensons had lived well for their time. The house was classic Middle Georgian period, built of brick. It had a stone portico in the center of the front face with 2 symmetrical windows either side on the ground floor and 5 above. Inside, to the left of the hall, there was a sitting room with a door that led through to the dining room. On the far side of this room, another door gave access to a service passage and the kitchen and staff wing beyond. On the right of the hall, 2 doors gave access to a grander sitting room at the front and what had clearly been Dr. Stevenson's study to the rear. A handsome staircase of 3 flights climbed from the hall to the first floor. Underneath the stairs, a door led through to the service corridor. We all went upstairs. By unspoken common consent, we had clearly decided to get an overall impression of the whole house before looking at any room in detail. On the first floor there were 4 bedrooms, 1 in each corner of the house, whilst the space above the front hall was occupied by an antiquated bathroom with freestanding, roll-top bath and high-level lavatory cistern. Once again, all the bedrooms were fully furnished, and I found it particularly affecting to see that what had been the children's bedrooms still had toys on the shelves. Having walked round the house together, each of us now gravitated towards the room we had individually found most intriguing during our overview. Sarah and Paul stayed in the nursery. I personally found this too redolent of sad memories and crossed to the principal bedroom. Graham wandered downstairs to the study. Dr. and Mrs. Stevenson had chosen their bedroom well. 2 windows at the front and 2 to the side gave sweeping views across the garden, now sadly overgrown. You could still, with difficulty, make out the areas that had been lawn and which flower beds. The room was furnished with a heavy mahogany bedroom suite comprising bed, lady's vanity table, gentleman's chest of drawers, and 2 wardrobes, I guessed, one his, one hers. Opening one, I was proved right, as Mrs. Stevenson's dresses and skirts still hung inside. Without quite knowing why, because it was extremely intrusive, I lifted one of the dresses out of the wardrobe and examined it. It was very much 50s fashion and just the sort of thing to have been worn by an upper-middle-class doctor's wife. It was made of heavy silk in a bold floral pattern in pink and green. Sleeveless, it was knee-length with a slim pencil skirt. Again, not knowing what prompted me, I took the dress across to a floor-length mirror that stood against a wall and held the dress up in front of me. Now I have never had any interest in women's clothing, so have no idea why I did this. I held the dress to my body and thought how flattering the cut and color was. This was bizarre behavior, and shaking my head vigorously to snap out of my daze, I swiftly returned the dress to its hanger and hurried from the room. Descending the stairs, I called out to Graham that I was ready to start discussing potential shots with him. Graham came out of the study and I was struck that there was something subtly different about him. Was it my imagination, or was his grizzled hair browner and cut shorter than previously? He also held himself more erect, and I could detect no trace of his prominent beer belly. In fact, he was rather dishy. Dishy, what was I thinking? Graham was a friend and colleague of many years' standing, and I had never thought of him as dishy before. The atmosphere of this house was getting to all of us. Just then Sarah and Paul came downstairs. Again, there was something about the way they moved and held themselves that was different to what it had been before we entered the house. Sarah was sucking her thumb and flicking her skirt like a little girl, whilst Paul was demurely holding her hand, taking little mincing steps, with his eyes downcast, looking shyly at the floor. "This will never do," I exclaimed. "If we don't get on, we shall never finish what we came to do, and, as ever, it will fall to me to clean up behind you. A woman's work is never done." A woman's work is never done. Had I really just used that expression in connection with myself? I could hardly believe my ears. "Steady on, old girl," said Graham. "If we all rally round, we will get everything done in next to no time." And with that he turned and went back into the study, closing the door behind him. "Mummy, will it be all right if we get out the best dollies to play with?" "We promise we won't break them?" asked Sarah, standing in front of me. "Of course, dear," I heard myself replying. "Now run along with your sister and behave yourselves, Mummy has things to do." Sarah and Paul turned and ran back upstairs, giggling with delight. I leaned against the newel post, fighting for breath. What was happening here? Was I going mad? I couldn't understand why we were all behaving so peculiarly. Why were Sarah and Paul behaving like small children, and why was I speaking as though I were a woman, and more than that, a mother? I tried to calm down and think things through rationally. I had to admit that I too had behaved in an untypical fashion whilst in the bedroom upstairs. This thought had no sooner crossed my mind than my feet, seemingly of their own volition, started walking me up to the first floor. Try as I might, I could not stop myself. I walked once more into the principal bedroom, crossed to Mrs. Sanderson's wardrobe and took out the dress I had admired earlier. I laid the dress on the bed and moved to her bureau. Opening the top drawer, I was greeted by the sight of neatly arranged piles of lingerie. My hands carefully moved items to one side until I came upon an old-fashioned, zip-sided girdle. I took this out and laid it down next to the dress. Next I found myself selecting a matching set of bra, French knickers, and half-slip. They were made of ivory silk and were lavishly trimmed with lace. From another drawer I took an unopened packet of fully fashioned nylon stockings. All the while I was doing this, my racing brain was telling me that it was wrong, and I was desperately trying to force myself to stop, all to no avail. Having laid the clothing out on the bed, I started to undress. Surely this weird compulsion wasn't going so far as to make me put the clothes on? The very idea was ridiculous. Even if I had wanted to dress as a woman and I didn't, there was no way these delicate garments would fit my burly frame. But that was exactly what happened next. No sooner was I naked but that I stepped into the girdle, wriggled it up round my waist and fastened the hooks and zipper. To my amazement it fitted. Either the garment had stretched more than was reasonable, or my waistline had inexplicably shrunk. Next I sat on the edge of the bed, opened the packet of nylons, rolled them into a donut shape and carefully slid first one and then the other over my feet and up my legs. Making sure that I had the seams straight, I fastened the welts of the stockings to the garter tabs dangling from the bottom of the girdle. I then stepped into the knickers and pulled them up over my hips. The half-slip followed next. From the waist down I was now totally clad in female undergarments. My horror increased as my hands reached out and picked up the bra. In spite of my best endeavors, I could not resist slipping my arms through the straps and reaching round to fasten the hooks and eyes at the back. I was shocked at just how easily and naturally I carried out this intricate maneuver. I had wrestled too many times with ladies' bras trying to get them off, not to realize that there was no way I should have been able to put one on so easily. Looking at myself in the mirror, my worst fears were realized. The lingerie had not got bigger, my body had shrunk to fit them. My appearance was bizarre to say the least. There I stood dressed only in female lingerie, the bra cups hanging limply on my breastless torso. I started to fear that this state of affairs might not last for long and, of course, at that moment, as the thought entered my head, my chest flush started to expand until, before long, the bra was containing and supporting two beautiful globes of milk-white flesh. The thought popped into my head that my breasts were in rather good condition for a woman of 30 who had suckled 2 children. Where did that notion come from? Now that I looked at myself more carefully, I noticed that other parts of my body had also changed shape. I now sported a narrow waist, swelling hips, a pert, pear-shaped bottom and elegant legs that rose from slim ankles to dimpled knees and onto smoothly rounded thighs. I had a figure any woman would kill for, but one that I, as a man, only wanted to go away. I sat down on the stool that stood in front of Mrs. Stevenson's vanity table, fighting to calm my beating heart by taking slow, deep breaths. I couldn't help being distracted by the way my deep breathing caused my newly acquired bosom to swell voluptuously. As I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I was greeted by the incongruous sight of an attractive, lingerie-clad, female body topped off with my aging male head. Unable to resist, I opened the drawer of the vanity and took out various items of makeup. As I spread foundation across my face, applied powder, and started to work on my eyes, the structure of my face subtly altered. Before my eyes, it morphed and shifted until my skin, previously rough with beard stubble, was porcelain smooth, my somewhat overlarge nose became pert with a cute tilt at the tip. My eyebrows retreated into a pair of smooth arches, and my eyes widened and changed color from brown to a brilliant blue. Beneath the makeup I could still recognize myself, but as I might have looked had I been born a girl and some 15 years younger. I finished of the makeup with an application of bright red lipstick, which I carefully blotted with a piece of tissue paper. Next my hands picked up a brush and I found myself brushing my hair. As I did so, my hair lengthened and turned from mouse brown to golden blonde. Externally I looked all female. As I replaced the hairbrush on the vanity, I noticed that my hands had become slim and elegant, my nails were longer and had somehow acquired a coating of bright red varnish. I stood and looked at my reflection. Not bad for a mother of two, I thought to myself, running my hands down my sides and smoothing out the half-slip. It was most peculiar. It was as if I were two people at the same time. Sam was appalled at what was happening to him but could do nothing to stop it. Mary, on the other hand, was relaxed and delighted to be back in her old bedroom. As you will have guessed, I had in some inexplicable way been taken over by the ghost of Mary Stevenson and transformed into her image. She seemed to have no memory of having been murdered because the emotion I was receiving from her part of my brain was one of calm confidence and love. There was enough of Sam remaining in me for me to put my hand under my slip and inside my knickers. It was as I feared. My male parts had vanished, to be replaced by the vagina and triangle of pubic hair of a mature woman. Now I guess I should have been terrified by what was happening to me, but I wasn't. Mary's calmness was the controlling emotion and Sam seemed to be willing to go with the flow. I moved to the bed and picked up the silk dress I had taken from the wardrobe earlier. I unzipped it and stepped into the slim-fitting skirt. I wriggled into the dress and with a dexterity I had not previously possessed, fastened it up at the back. I lifted the skirt and tugged my slip into place before smoothing the silk over my tummy and hips. Reaching for a jewel box that stood on the vanity, I inserted a pair of pearl earrings into my, now pierced, ears, and fastened a matching necklace around my slim throat. The dress had a boat-shaped neckline and the pearl necklace looked lovely against my milky skin. A little pearl bracelet and slim, gold, lady's watch completed my jewelry, and I slipped my nylon-clad feet into a pair of high-heeled pumps before giving myself a quick spray of perfume. I smiled as I admired myself in the mirror. Yes, I was still a beautiful woman even if I was now 28 years old and the mother of two wonderful girls. No woman could have a better husband than my John. It was a very strange experience. I felt totally comfortable as a woman, although, at the same time, I knew I was Sam Jackson, reporter on the Courier. Somehow Mary Stevenson and I were able to coexist in the one, admittedly female, body. I slowly walked out of the bedroom and down the stairs. I could feel the tug of the suspenders on my girdle as I walked and my nylons rasped sensuously as they rubbed together. As I reached the landing halfway down the stairs, I could see John, Alice, and Wendy standing together in the hall. My John was so handsome, I felt a surge of desire rush through me. And my precious girls, they were both looking so solemn. Wendy was clutching her elder sister's hand and, whilst I knew they were actually Sarah and Paul, my heart went out to them. "Oh, my darlings," I cried, "it has been such a long time but, at long last, we are all together again." I hurried down the remaining flight of stairs and gathered the girls in my arms. I had tears in my eyes as I kissed and hugged them. I rose to my feet and turned to John. He had a broad smile on his face as he embraced me. Even though I knew John was also Graham, I returned his kisses with enthusiasm. "I take it we are all aware of the dual nature of our personalities?" John said, taking command of the situation. "Yes, dear," I replied, and the girls nodded. John continued, "I am guessing that in some way the spirits of the Stevensons have been preserved by their old home and are coming. The first people to enter the house in 50 years has given them the chance to reanimate. But our old personalities haven't been obscured. Our bodies may have altered, but I know full well that this beautiful woman is not only my wife Mary, but also my old mate Sam, and that you too," and he gestured towards Alice and Wendy, "are not only young girls, but also grown-up college students Sarah and Paul. Incidentally, which one of you is which?" "I'm Sarah," said Alice. "And I'm Paul," responded Wendy. "I have to say it feels odd being a girl," he continued. "You should complain," I said with a laugh. "Just wait until you grow up and have to cope with a bra and girdle." "Do you think we are stuck like this?" asked Alice/Sarah. Only whilst I am, of course, used to being female, I don't really fancy going through puberty and the teenage years for a second time, thank you very much. I don't know, replied John/Graham thoughtfully. Maybe when we leave the house reality will click back to normal and we will become our old selves again. Well, let's try it and see, I interjected hurriedly. The four of us instinctively held hands as John opened the front door and we stepped out onto the porch. For a moment everything blurred and I felt very giddy and nauseous. Then things came back into focus as I looked out across the neatly manicured lawns of number 27, Chestnut Avenue. But this place was totally overgrown when we came in, I remarked in a bemused fashion. Yes, and that isn't the only thing that has changed, said the man standing by my side. Look at us. I turned and looked at the man carefully. Of course I recognized him, it was Graham Stevenson, owner of a fashionable photographic studio and my husband. My husband? Yes, of course, I was Samantha Stevenson, 40 years old, and the features editor of our county lifestyle magazine, and these two charming young women were our twin daughters Sarah and Pauline. The girls were in their final year at university, where they were studying history, and were home for the holidays. It was August 2013 and we had been living at number 27 for a whole year. In fact, I was busy preparing an anniversary party for the four of us this coming weekend. I looked at us all more closely. Sarah and Pauline were fashionable dressed in tight little miniskirts and loose cotton tops. Their long, bare legs were perched upon high platform heels. I had long since given up trying to convince them that such shoes were doing their feet no favors and that they would suffer as I did when they got older. I could still remember being their age when spike-heeled stilettos were all the rage and my mother saying much the same to me. Graham, my husband, was tall and slim, with a little mustache. I loved the way it tickled my nose when we kissed. I was wearing a smart, cream linen suit with sling-back sandals. I had just got home from the office and couldn't wait to slip into something casual and more suitable for a lovely summer's evening with my family. I'll just go and change, I said to Graham. You fix us all a drink. I'll have a glass of Pinot Grigio, please. I went inside and upstairs to our bedroom. As I slipped out of my suit and peeled off my tights, I experienced an odd sense of déjà vu. For a brief moment everything was clear. I was Sam Jackson, reporter. I was also Mary Stevenson, 1950s mother and housewife. But in this reality I was Samantha Stevenson. I remembered that Graham's grandfather had been Dr. John Stevenson's younger brother Philip. When John was so cruelly murdered, along with his lovely family, Philip had inherited the house on Chestnut Avenue. In this timeline there never had been an Australian heir. Graham's grandfather, and after him his father, had found the prospect of living in number 27 too distressing after what had happened there and had let the house to others. It was different for Graham and I. We were 2 generations removed from these tragic events and had never known John, Mary, and their daughters. Graham's father had died a couple of years previously, and, with his passing, the way became open for us to take possession of the old family house for ourselves and, on the expiry of the current tenancy, move in. The old house had required a lot of renovation to bring it back to how we wanted it to be, and the last year had been hard work. However, in some odd way the house had seemed pleased to once more have a Stevenson family in residence. I am not normally superstitious, but it had seemed meant. Graham and I had lavished money and time on restoring the old house to its former glory, and we now felt truly settled. The girls loved it as much as we did and seized every excuse to come home for a few days when university studies allowed. Having undressed from my office clothes, I enjoyed a leisurely shower to wash away the grime and stress of the working day, before slipping into a clean set of undies and a pretty summer dress. As I glanced out of the window, I could see Pauline carrying a tray of drinks out onto the lawn. Leaning out of the window, I called out, "I'll be down in a second, darling. We can all enjoy our drinks together and then I'll get supper." I turned and smiled happily as I looked around the lovely bedroom I shared with Graham. I felt a warm glow of anticipation spread through my tummy as I contemplated the lovemaking that would undoubtedly ensure with Graham at bedtime. My man was a real tiger in bed and I was no slouch myself. I hurried downstairs to my family, banishing all thoughts of Sam and Mary from my mind. I knew deep down that Samantha was an amalgam of the souls of both Sam and Mary, but I was so comfortable in my own skin as Samantha that I did not need to worry about how, in other circumstances, my life or lives could have turned out so very differently. As of now, I was mother of 2 wonderful girls and wife to a sexy husband. That was good enough for me.